Stoker. Thank you all for coming. We know that some of you have traveled far and made the journey to come to this lovely event, and we really appreciate it. It's lovely to see so many of our past members and other people affiliated with the society. So we're going to move straight into the event. First of all, I'm going to introduce you to our chair for this evening, Professor Charlotte Colleen. Professor Colleen is a professor at Trinity with a research focus mostly on the literature and culture of Victorian Britain and Ireland. He has published 5 monographs, 2 on Wilde and 3 on Irish literature. He's edited 3 collections of essays, including 1 on Bram Stoker, as well as helped organize 2 major international symposia for Trinity, including 1 on Bram Stoker in 2012. He's currently publishing his 6th monograph this year, which is on Imagining the Irish Child, Discourses of Childhood in Irish Anglican Writing of the 17th and 18th centuries. And then our speaker this evening will be Dacre Stoker. Dacre Stoker is the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker and an international best-selling author of Dracula, the Undead, and Dracula. He co-edited Bram Stoker's Lost Journal, The Dublin Years, and Slains Castle's Secret History. Dacre has also been consulted and appeared in recent film documentaries about vampires in literature and popular culture, and him and his wife, Jen, also helped to manage the Bram Stoker estate. So again, thank you all for coming, and I'll hand it over to Professor Jones.
Thank you very much for inviting me, members of the Hist. I want to start with a quote from Dracula. I have more. My revenge has just begun. I spread it over centuries, and time is on my side. These are words spoken by Count Dracula as he is confronted and apparently trapped by his enemies, the Crew of Light, towards the middle of the novel. The Crew of Light led by the incomprehensible Professor Abraham Van Helsing. Even though by the end of Bram Stoker's novel, the vampire has been vanquished, or apparently vanquished, by the purity-loving, steak and garlic-wielding do-gooders, Dracula has ultimately triumphed over his antagonists. Popular culture has forgotten the names of his enemies, Arthur Holmwood, Jonathan Harper, John Seward, Quincy Morris, and Mina Murray. Count Dracula is a name that is known everywhere, recognized practically everywhere on the planet. In fact, it wouldn't be going too far to suggest that with Dracula we were dealing not so much with a literary character as an epic anti-hero who was broken free of the novel which gave him birth. And he's taken up habitation in popular culture worldwide. Although Dracula was relatively well received when it was first published in 1897, I think it would have been impossible at that stage to imagine the global impact this modestly ambitious novel from a man then best known as the manager of the great Victorian actor Henry Irving, the impact that it would have on the 20th and now well into the 21st century. Not only is Dracula the best known vampire of them all, and we've been living in a vampire craze since the 18th century, but he is one of the most recognizable characters in literary history and one of the most portrayed in films, bar none, even counting God Almighty himself. There's more films with Dracula than there is of any other character. Along with some other characters from 19th century popular fiction like Ebenezer Scrooge, Oliver Twist, Sherlock Holmes, Frankenstein, Count Dracula can claim mythic status. This mythic status has sometimes blurred our attention towards his creator, Bram Stoker. It's one of the tragedies in the sense of the success, the surprising success of Count Dracula, that Bram Stoker has almost been forgotten. So it is for this reason I am delighted to welcome his great-grandnephew, Dacre Stoker, to the College Historical Society. Bram once described the College Historical Society as Trinity's supplementary school. In other words, you come here when you're not attending the lectures in order to get a real education. And he spent a lot of time in the Hist, probably more time than he did in classes and lectures. He served in the offices as Society Librarian, Record Secretary, and of course in 1872 he was elected auditor by one vote. I don't know if subsequent supposed to have been as close as this one, but he was elected by 1 vote. And he spent probably some of his happiest time at the debates that were conducted here. So it's very appropriate that he is being commemorated by the Hist. And his first real publication was his address as the auditor of the society. He gave an address called the Necessity of Political Honesty, which is particularly appropriate given the events in London that have just occurred today.
And America.
I've known Dacre Stoker for over a decade, since he came to a conference on Bram Stoker that I helped organise on the centenary of his death in 2012. Dacre came to talk about this book, The Lost Journal of Bram Stoker, which he edited with Elizabeth Miller, who was an eminent Dracula critic and scholar. This is a journal that Stoker kept during his years living in Dublin. It's a fascinating glimpse into Stoker's life in the 1870s. And given that Stoker's handwriting is almost completely illegible, the fact that Dacre and Elizabeth managed to transcribe and interpret it in an effort to bring new scholarly light and attention on a very neglected aspect of his great granduncle's life tells us much, I think, about his genuine devotion to recovering as full a picture of Bram Stoker as is possible. Dacre is as much a horror aficionado as a Bram Stoker scholar. He is the best-selling co-author of 2 novels, Dracula, The Undead, a sequel to Dracula, and in 2018, Dracula, a prequel to the original novel. He's also taken after his great-granduncle in a different way. Bram Stoker was crowned the athletic champion of Dublin, believe it or not, while he was a student in Trinity College. And it's no surprise to find that Dacre devoted himself to physical education for more than 20 years. He taught physical education in his native Canada and in the United States. And he was himself an athlete in the sport of the modern pentathlon and coached at an international and Olympic level for Canada for 12 years. And with his wife, he manages the Bram Stoker estate. So I'd like you now to welcome Dacre, who will talk to us about why there is more to Bram Stoker than Dracula.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you very much. Jarl, that about wraps everything up. We can now go upstairs and take, he has covered many things that I'm going to talk on in a little more depth. I have known Jarl for a while and respected your reputation at Trinity. It really opens up my eyes, because this is one of the places, and I know many of you sitting here have intimate knowledge and relationship with your experiences with Trinity and the Hist, but for outsiders, it's not easy to understand the culture, find some of the information. There's been fires, records have been lost, but because of Jarlath and others in this room, I thank you for inviting me here. I'm going to give you a bit of a sort of a survey from a different perspective. I do work in scholarly areas. I won't talk much about Bram and his politics, or much about him and his interest in religion. But as Jarlath said, I've been a teacher for 25 years. I've been an athletic coach. I've been a father. I've been now a grandfather. So I'm coming from this perspective in an area that has really interested me about my famous great-granduncle, and that's that human side, sort of from the behavioral psychology, something that has interested me in the people that I've coached and I have taught and I have fathered, to find out what makes these people tick and how to get the best out of them as an athlete or a student. That's probably my mother calling to make sure that I've turned my phone off, which, there we go, I knew that would happen sometime. So let's get on with this then. You've already heard enough about me, but for those of you that are interested in following the Dracula trail, as Jarlath mentions and others, there are some existing bits and pieces around the world that I have been on a hunt for. It's much like a big puzzle. So for the past 15 years, to better understand him, I've gone to the Rosenbach Museum and looked into Bram's notes, and many people have profited from that. The Dracula typescript that Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, purchased for just under $1 million is in Seattle, Washington, and it's very revealing. The lost journal that Bram's great-grandsons have made available to me, was very helpful in working with Elizabeth Miller, who passed away just a couple of years ago, was a labor of love and did open up our eyes and others to Bram's important times here in Dublin. And then recently there's been a discovery in the London Library of Bram's research, which I'll get to in more detail in a moment, and then the Stoker family papers that are here at Trinity, along with lockets of hair of the nanny that became a character in one of my non-fictional novels. Fictional novels, but that was supposed to be a little bit of a hit, because the prequel to Dracula is as much fiction as it is non-fiction, because of some of the research that I've been able to find here. And recently I published, along with another Dracula scholar who was a great friend of Miller's, Robert Etienne-Bassang, who also passed away recently. And that's the Dracula annotated for the 125th anniversary. So when I throw myself into these projects, it gets me to some very interesting places to find these pieces of the puzzle so I can better understand Uncle Bram. And I'm going to take you on some of these today. Recently, we've discovered, along with a fellow named Mike Shepherd in Cruden Bay, Scotland, newspaper articles in Aberdeenshire. And one of the things about Bram is we get all kinds of different, let's call it sensational approaches to try to sell the papers. And sometimes they tell mistruths. Sometimes they don't. This was back in the 30s, where Bram's wife was quoted as saying during one of their holidays in Cruden Bay, Mike has found out that Bram actually wrote Dracula and 3 other novels in Cruden Bay. He spent 14 summers there. That when he was writing Dracula, she says, he seemed to be obsessed by the spirit of the thing, and at times we were scared of him, which is normal when you look into Bram and understand why. Because Bram and Irving were actually got into and revolutionized method acting. So I am sure, when I look at this, that Bram was simply doing what he did with Irving naturally when he got into his writing. There were reports of him marching up and down the 2.5-mile beach of Cruden Bay, pondering over Harker and Goldeming and others. That would scare his wife and his son. But on the other newspaper article, it actually talked about people in the town that said, as I say, on closer inspection, when you have to look at this, people in the town would call him a jolly Irishman full of jokes. So he could turn it on and off. He wasn't just this sort of maniacal person, dark person, which we will get into in a few moments about how his dark sense of imagination was created, but he was able to turn it on and off when he was doing his writing, but he really was a jolly Irishman full of jokes. I'm going to base some of my observations, though, on this, and it is something that I found written in a newspaper, the Trinity College newspaper, by a fellow named Jean-Francois in November of 1958. The author seemed as fascinated as I have been in understanding Bram. So I'll share portions of this article with you, and I'll read between some of the lines. I'll also share some of the findings from some of the other things I've done as I try to make a character profile, much like somebody would do if you were hunting down a serial killer. And you look at bits and pieces of things that they have said, that other people say about them, and interpret them in my way. Now, you've heard about the Lost Journal of Bram Stoker, the Dublin Years, and I'm going to give you a little glimpse of it to show sort of what Bram was going through while he was here at Trinity. So you see, Pain to Bravery was a poem. And I believe, after looking at this, that he would take the train and go to Greystones, where he could get away from the hustle and bustle of Trinity or Dublin Castle while he was working there, and he could ponder and he could think. He also was looking into certain macabre things. And one of them, at the very bottom of the screen, was the fire at Delaney's on Westmoreland Street. Now, he dated that 1866, although he didn't write it till about 1871. But it was a horrifying commentary that caught Bram's eye. One of the Delaneys was here at Trinity with him, and the family was actually caught in a horrible fire. They were a family that were selling furs and feathers and things, and a lot of combustible chemicals involved, and this fire started up when the father and the son were out for a walk. And they came back to see that this fire had engulfed the whole home, and the family had moved up and up and up the stairs, while the onlookers were coming by saying, "Don't worry, don't jump, the new fire brigade is coming with the new ladders." So they got all the way up to the roof, and when the ladder brigade got there and put up the brand new ladders to go and rescue these people, they collapsed. So the ladders didn't work. And the family were all died. And what I actually saw in the paper, in his paper, was fire at Delaney's Westmoreland Street, inquest, servant's mother putting hand into the coffin. Well, I thought originally, oh, we've hit pay dirt, we've got something to do with vampires and coffins and so on. But in fact, it was much deeper. It caught Bram's eye of what a sort of injustice, mistakes happen. And that's all it was, but that's the example of some of the things we go on. What caught Bram's eye? We also caught, what I caught Bram's eye was a damned lie, he said. I once knew a little boy who put so many flies into a bottle that they had not room to die. Maybe that was the roots of Renfield years later that started here in Dublin. Maybe he had a little friend who was keeping little bugs like children do in a bottle. That's Bram. And then another one that caught Elizabeth's eye, that she said, oh, had he just read Frankenstein, or was this an original thought? Story of man brought to life in a dissecting room by the affliction of a power unexpected. Just random thoughts that, as you think this through and put it in perspective, gives us an idea of what Bram was thinking of. Now, during this time, and I'm really happy to say that some of the members of the Dublin Painting and Sketching Club are here, but this is another interest that Bram had. This is sort of a creative part of his brain that was engaged by painting. His two sisters were involved in the arts, and unlike others in Bram's family, he was drawn to the arts. And he was a founding member. Now, in 2012, Aidan Hickey, who's here tonight, painted this wonderful portrait of Bram, and it's sort of a collage of Bram and his Dracula connections with Christopher Lee and Whitby Abbey and so on. One of the things, obviously, that he's most remembered for. I think of Bram as a man with a full brain engaged, and part of it is tied up into art. And as we'll see later, the theater and drawing and so on. But the other side, not so much. We'll see about that in just a sec. So back to the article for a moment. I'll read some of the lines, as I said, in between the lines. But before I tell you about that, I have to mention that a lot of my research, I have to give credit to Mr. Paul Murray, who is in attendance tonight. His very fine biography of Bram, From the Shadow of Dracula, really gives the best details of any biography going. And a lot of them don't. They tend to move towards sensationalism. But because of Paul and your fine work, I'm able to help put some of these dots together. And it's interesting that I'm not sure if Mr. Francois ever knew you from the dates, but a lot of things in his articles and in your From the Shadow of Dracula line up with some of the mysterious things to me that happened here in Trinity. So it was written in 1958, and the article begins and talks about the College Historical Society. At the opening of the College Historical Society, a speaker mentioned a former auditor whose career both in Trinity and in the outside world varied as much as the activities of Victorian contemporaries. This was Bram Stoker. To those who bother to read credit titles of films, the appearances of Stoker's name as the author of Dracula might have been somewhat startling. For at first sight, there appears to be a vast gulf between the auditor of the College Historical Society of Trinity College and a mystery tale which thrilled and horrified novel readers half a century to go. Well, over the course of Bram's life, he wrote more than just Dracula, as you can see on the screen. He wrote 12 other novels, some fictional, some non-fictional. He also wrote many short stories, some quite sensational, some romantic, some dealing with other parts of the world, some dealing with Ireland. Dracula was published, though, in 1897. It was well received, although initially a few of the reviewers were quite hard on the violent and dark supernatural nature of the story. By 1958, when the article was written, Dracula was very well known around the world. It became a classic in 1962. Bela Lugosi has been starring on the stage since 1924, and in the Universal film Dracula in 1931, and Sir Christopher Lee and Hammer Studios' Horror Dracula 58, and so on and so forth. I do have to give credit, even though Bram obviously never crossed paths with Bela Lugosi, he never even got to see his book adapted onto stage. See, he died in 1912, and it was 10 years later that his widow, worked very hard at first on her own with a guy called Charles Morel to create a stage adaptation, which didn't go over very well. And then she finally teamed up with Irishman Hamilton Dean. And then he teamed up with John Balderston, and they took it to the United States, and it was a huge hit. And I say, and it's actually 2 days ago, I was contacted by the Lugosi estate. I'm quite good friends with Lynn Lugosi, the granddaughter of Bela, who they're working on a biography. And they said, would you give a Zoom interview? So I did over in the University Club, David, and chatted with the author. And he said, can you sum it up, the relationship? And I said, well, they were years apart, but there was a symbiotic relationship between Bram Stoker's novel and Bela Lugosi's acting. Lugosi would have been, I wouldn't say he would have been nowhere, he would have acted in other things, obviously. But playing Dracula on stage did something. It changed the persona of Bram's Dracula, made it quite different. Bram's Dracula is a ugly revenant from the grave, not the dashing Eastern European count that Lugosi was, but that was necessary to put on stage plays and then later on movies. And Bram Stoker's sales of his novels really skyrocketed with the success on stage and on film as well. So therein lies this symbiotic relationship between the two. Now the article continues. On closer examination of the career of Bram Stoker, one is struck by the remarkable diversity of his interests. Not only was the author of Dracula the auditor of the Hist, but a former president of the Phil. It's in these varied positions that he should primarily be remembered. Abraham Stoker entered Trinity in 1866 to read mathematics. He joined the University Philosophical Society. A prophetic link with his later work is found to be the essay he read before the Society while a senior freshman. It was entitled Sensationalism in Fiction and Society. His mind could not, however, have been entirely on essay composition, for in that year he was already the athletic champion of his university. Now, indeed, I think Mr. Francois' remarks and closer examination is required to better understand Bram and his diversity of interests and challenges to overcome, starting with the troubles of his very young age. So he was born in 1847, Black 47 they call it, in Clontarf, Ireland, because of all the disease from potato famines and cholera epidemics. It couldn't have been a very rosy time for the Stoker family. Bram was the third of 7 children. He wasn't expected to live, had some sort of strange, mysterious illness for the first 7 years of his life. I've done lots of research with doctors who understand Victorian ailments, and nobody really knows what it was. I have a theory, not a lot of backup to it, but I think it might have been respiratory allergies and asthma. That was very serious. But he did recover. And he recovered it after 7 years to become a champion athlete. And that's why I think it was something that you can grow out of. That whatever the disease was didn't scar his body that would have stopped him from becoming a champion athlete on these grounds. So he did recover. And he went to Bective House School. He was tutored as well. So there was a gap between 7 years when he recovered and when he came here just before his 17th birthday of what was going on in this young boy's life. That's the type of age that I taught young people. And I know that he grew to be a tall young man, so he was probably an awkward, gangly guy. He was probably very shy, but he was coming into his own physically, but where was he emotionally? What kind of guy recovers from being ill for 7 years? And as you'll see, very few comments that he's given us without any autobiography. There's bits and pieces in a book he wrote called Personal Reminiscence of Henry Irving that gives us little nuggets to pick up on, which I will in a moment. But he wrote his exams and got into Trinity. And just as Jarlath said, and Paul has said and others, he really thrived outside the classroom. Philosophical and historical societies and drama and so on. But he also had to work at Dublin Castle. And I'm not sure about the had to, but his father, who'd been there for 40 years, he retired and paved the way for Bram to take the job. 3 of the other boys were in medical school, so maybe it was the financial need to have somebody working. Maybe father recognized that, well, Bram, since you're not going to go to medical school and you're at Trinity, you're going to need to go to Dublin Castle and get a real job. And that's what he did. I think it probably was a little bit of a difficult time for Bram, because this was when he was that creative soul beginning to write. Remember, the artist in Bram. And he was still keeping that journal, being a budding writer, when he was subjected to becoming the mundane clerk in the Petty Sessions Legal Department. But just like Bram, he makes the best of it. And he gets promoted to be the Inspector of Petty Sessions all over Ireland, which gets him to start traveling around the country, which in Bram's world is not so bad. And I will start throwing in these little connections every now and then, because I tend to think that when Bram wrote Dracula, that part of his life was not too undifferent than Jonathan Harker, traveling by train to far-off places, by carriages to far-off places, to make sure all the legalities were working. That's what he did as the Inspector of Petty Sessions. Well, then he married Florence Balcom, and we all know that some say he stole her away from Oscar Wilde. I'm not sure how much the stealing was, but I think she found better prospects with Bram, especially since he had recently met Henry Irving while here in Dublin after doing his theatrical reviews, and had good prospects to go off to London. And that's a job he had for 27 years. And then writing Dracula over a 7-year period during his holidays. We believe most of that was done in Cruden Bay, Scotland, after one of the holidays in Whitby. And he died April 20th, 1912, the same week that the Titanic went down. Now, it all really does start, though, with his mother. Everything starts with a mother. And when you really think about Bram's writing and his life, I really think his mother had an awful lot to do with him. And she was quite an interesting lady. Much has been made of the story that she actually wrote up of her experiences narrowly escaping death of the cholera epidemic in 1832 in Sligo. It's a story that we believe she told Bram orally during his 7 years of needing bedtime stories and other stories that he would have been told about Irish mythology and folklore, and that's how he absorbed some of these really interesting and dark cautionary tales. But it also involved misdiagnosis and premature burial. One of the neighbors' husbands found the wife in great pain, thought she had the cholera, tied a red scarf around her waist, put her on his back, and took her to the hospital. And the hospital was without nurses and doctors because they had mostly all died. Street people were there administering the laudanum to the ailing just to make their passing a little bit easier. And this lady was brought in, not expecting to live. Husband went off to work and came back at the end of the day, wondering how his wife was, and said, "Oh no, she's in the dead house." Well, there are no more funerals, but there was a big pit at the end of town, and that is actually still today as a memorial, that she's in the pit with the other. She didn't make it. So he went to pay his respects and found the red scarf still wrapped around her, and that there was movement in her. As a matter of fact, he pulled off some of the dead bodies, and there was lots of life left in her. She didn't have the cholera at all. And she dragged herself out and lived for many years. So imagine young Bram sick himself, and if it was respiratory allergies and asthma or whatever it was, with trouble breathing, I can imagine that sort of trauma that would have probably set in, hearing these things, and if they misdiagnosed her, what could happen to him? Now, I did chat to some psychiatrists about this, and they said, boy, Sigmund Freud would have had a field day with this. Well, I think Dracula was part and parcel as a result of this, and maybe some of his other stories that needed a dark sense of imagination. But to make matters even more interesting, Bram actually asked his mother to type up that story. It wasn't just left as an oral version. She typed it up. It sits here in your library, 17 pages. And that account of the cholera epidemic is one of the most accurate accounts by the officials in Sligo of what happened to people, not just the Thornley family. He used it, as if misery loves company, for a book of children's horror stories called Under the Sunset, in a story, The Invisible Giant. So yes, I think Bram was told that story. I think we have some proof, and I think it affected him. And this is that quote I was telling you about from Personal Reminiscence. I'm going to read it to you and just think about young Bram. And when I read this, I think there's a lot understated here. Bram says, "I was a very strong man. It is true that I had known weakness. In my babyhood, I understand, to be often at the point of death. Certainly till I was about 7 years old, I never knew what it was like to stand upright. I was naturally thoughtful, and the leisure of long illness gave opportunity for many thoughts which were fruitful according to their kind in later years. I think that's Bram is telling us that he suffered a little bit, but he benefited from some of those stories as well. Now, this is a bit of a long shot, but bear with me. I can take some license. I'm a family member. I did find a treatise from one of Bram's uncles, a William Stoker, who was quite a famous fever doctor and performed bloodletting like many people did in the day. And if Bram had these illnesses that I was telling you about, and if it produced some fevers, there's a very good opportunity that he would have been bloodlet himself. And if he was, from 0 to 7, not sure how many times, it might have also created fruitful thoughts for later years of women in white coming to either leech him or cut him. But what was interesting in this treatise was how they actually described the bloodletting on little children. They really didn't know how much blood to take out. Oh, he's just a little guy. We'll put 2 or 3 leeches on him. It was take enough blood out until he passed out. And then they'd cover it up. And to rehydrate, a mixture of oil and claret, a nice red wine. So imagine this little traumatized child dehydrated and now drunk for a couple of days. Now, we do know that Bram actually developed a taste for claret later on, so that could actually back up my theory. Did it really happen? I honestly don't know. But I'll tell you this, though. When he wrote Dracula, in chapter 4, this caught my eye. When Jonathan Harker was searching around the castle after he's now convinced Count Dracula is supernatural and he's in deep trouble, he makes his way into one of these rooms and sees the Count lying down and picks up a shovel and tries to hit him in the forehead and kill him, and he misses. At that stage in the story, Harker's missing a lot of things. But one of the things Bram says is, as he describes the look of the Count, he says, "It seems as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion." First-hand experience? Maybe. Maybe not, but it does make a good story. Now, we've got to talk about sporting for a moment, because that was my background. And I'm very impressed with the diversity of the athletic skills involved in the sports that Bram involved himself in here. Especially simply after 10 years. He recovered to participate in long-distance race walking, so he would have had a robust cardiovascular system, rugby, great strength, rowing, leverage and strength, gymnastics, poise, balance, flexibility, the cricket ball throw, and one that still gets me to this day, long jump with trapeze. And he won awards for this. You can see he won the all-round athletics tankard, a beautiful race walking trophy that now sits in the Isle of Wight Sailing Club because his great-grandson has donated it to them, and they've added a standard to it with people who win sailing awards. So that's still in circulation, which is a nice thing. The tankard lives very comfortably Whitchurch-on-Thames. But Bram does say this in personal reminiscence as well. The early weakness, however, passed away in time, and I grew into a strong boy, and in time enlarged to become the biggest member of my family. When I was in my 20th year, I was the athletic champion of Dublin University. So he was proud of his athletic feats. And I believe, folks, that when I've seen young men and women excel, or at least come into their own in their body, grow into themselves, athletics normally is the grounds for that. And then you develop some self-confidence out of that. And I think he became a needed fellow. He became a committee member for all these sports, very engaged. And then he excelled in the Phil and the Hist and became a leader in those as well. So I think it's important to sort of note when we look at the kind of guy he is that sports played a very important role. And it sort of drove me crazy over the years when I began to see curriculums being chopped out of schools, that athletics and sports is usually, and arts is one of the first things to go. But these are two of the most important things that helped Bram excel and become the person that he is. As a matter of fact, a collector friend of mine found the logbook of the rowing club. And here it is, what mentions Bram in 1867. The club, having founded now, needed once to get to business and held its first race, and they didn't put the date in June, but the crew started the first lead race, and Mr. Kennedy and Stoker were racing, you can see. And the commentary is, the race was not distinguished by any remarkable features. Kennedy and Stoker took the lead from the start, which they increased to the end. Caldwell and Hartwig second by about 3 lengths. Good for Bram, he won a race. But to make things even more interesting, Paul Murray has hunted down an interesting commentary by his mother. So I can just see the mother that was very proud of Bram when 60 years later, just Charles Burton Barrington remembered Stoker vividly and said, Stoker, a big, strong, awkward chap, rowing in the number 4 at number 3, his mother keeping along the wall on a car called out, "They be beaten as none of them are keeping stroke with Abraham." If you know anything about rowing, which I do because my son rowed in college, university and high school, you're supposed to all keep stroke together. And I can imagine that Bram's exuberance and his strength was overtaking everybody else, which was not the thing you're supposed to do. So maybe it took him a while to get in sync with everybody, but that does tell me a little bit about Bram. He's going to pull as hard as he can, even if he upsets the rest of the fellows in the boat. But the gymnastics really interest me. It's 6'2". Now, maybe back in those days, gymnastic people could get away with being so big and strong and brawny. But when you read what Paul found in the gymnasium club entry here, it really sort of makes sense how Bram was a big, strong man and needed by his peers. Trinity, 1870, Mr. A. Stoker, who was foremost among his confreres in the gymnasium, in the classroom, and in various college literary societies, possessing great physical power, successfully attempted a feat on the trapeze, which even few professionals have achieved, and which it would be foolhardily for the majority of those matched against him on this occasion to essay. Suspended by the feet from the high stationary trapeze, he attached second ropes and bar to his wrists, and these being depended, 2 members, Messrs. S. Abraham and Gabber, performed a number of difficult evolutions thereon, Mr. Stoker meanwhile drawing them up towards him, apparently with perfect ease, certainly with very commendable self-confidence. What a sight to behold. And I'll tell you another sight. When I read that, and then I saw this in a book by Ellen Terry. Ellen Terry thought a lot of Bram Stoker. Bram really took Ellen under his wing at the Lyceum Theater. She was, of course, the leading lady and love interest of Henry Irving, which couldn't have been that easy. And good, steady Bram was always there for her. Now, she wrote about a time when they were all in Toronto. And I know there's some fellow Canadians here. Raise your hand if you're the person who came all the way from... I don't know where the big hill was, because we know it's quite flat. I lived in Oakville for a while. We didn't find too many hills. We had to go north. But there were some winter sports going on when Irving and Stoker and Terry took the Lyceum Theater off to Toronto to perform. And they found a place to go tobogganing. And Ellen Terry reports this. Ellen Terry, leading lady actress at the Lyceum Theater, even says that Bram tried his hand at the casual sport of tobogganing while on a Lyceum tour to wintertime in Toronto. Behind him, Stoker positioned himself, hesitating between trepidation and desire, until unable to resist the ice toboggan chutes, he leapt forward, fell off the toboggan right away, and went somersaulting down the hill, flapping his arms. I say undoubtedly things like this, and his gymnastics career here at Trinity probably saved his life as he flopped his way down the hill in Toronto and lived to tell the tale. So there is Bram yet again benefiting from his athletic background. But I also gained insight into Bram's life from some of his writing, some of his lesser-known writing. Now, The Mystery of the Sea is one of my favorite stories that Bram wrote. I think it's, in some cases, his second best story. It's about a character named Archibald Hunter, which is very autobiographical in my opinion. It's about a guy that goes to Cruden Bay, Scotland. He's got an invalid past. He's taken repeated visits to Cruden Bay. He studied law and has a great interest in technology. That is very Bram-esque. And he writes a story, Mystery of the Sea, but he publishes a short story, the first couple of chapters from that, just before the book comes out, called The Seer. And in The Seer, I believe Bram touches on his mystical side. But he also mentions a statement or two that I'm going to read to you. And he says, at college, this is Archibald Hunter, who is Bram, I'm convinced. At college, I was better off, for my big body and athletic powers gave me a certain position in which I had to overcome my natural shyness. So it all sort of comes together when I find these little nuggets spread apart in different places, and this one is not necessarily athletic. It must be noted at this point in his life that Bram has already won an art prize from the Royal Hibernian Society as a child. He attended stage plays with his father. So the gangly teenager with an interest in the arts is beginning to come into his own. This is a reminder that he is growing up in a household, though, with 3 brothers, my great-grandfather being one, who possess interest in sciences and go on to become quite well-known doctors. One brother will later become a civil servant, and his 2 sisters develop their talents as fine artists. I think Bram, the third of 7, was a bit of an outlier and may have been self-conscious about that. And I believe, though, he found his fertile environment for his intellectual development here at Trinity. In addition to the courses and all the varied opportunities that existed behind these walls, debating, drama, organized sport, the Phil, and of course, what I'm told is the oldest of all societies, the Historical Society. I think this is where the fertile ground here gave Bram his best start. A little bit late in life, but his best start. And as a result, he won some medals here. Bram's years at Trinity's were anything but typical, Paul Murray says. While he may not have distinguished himself in the classroom, he certainly did in the Phil and the Hist. Murray states that Bram had a high opinion of the Hist. As Jarlath already said, it was no ornamental appendage to Trinity College, but its supplementary school. He was actively involved in the Hist, as he was with many facets of college life, throwing himself with gusto into debates and politics of life, especially the committee work. He's a contributor, Bram is. I've seen many students over the years grow into themselves in and out of the classroom, and Bram was no exception. Trinity provided the right environment. His relationship with his professors, one of them right behind the banner here, Shaw and Dowden, to name a few, which stimulated his great inquisitive nature. Much has been written about Bram being the only student to hold the position of the head of the Phil and the auditor of the Hist at the same time. But this was not something that came easy to Bram. It wasn't just handed to him. As Jarlath already mentioned, in fact, he lost an election for auditor one year, and then the next year he won it by only 1 vote. Bram even survived a vote of impeachment in 1873 over a procedural matter. Things didn't come easy to Bram. He was a resilient young man. I think those early years of illness came back to help him in a funny sort of way. Now, Jean-Francois in his article states again, his career in the Phil advanced in a spectacular way. Not only did he receive a certificate in oratory and a silver medal in aesthetics, but rose from counselor to secretary. Stoker's career in the College Historical Society showed equal success. While librarian in 69 and 70, he won silver medals in history and composition. The following year was elected correspondence secretary, which I believe served him well when he started working for Henry Irving as his personal secretary, writing over 50 letters a day for over 27 years. And I've just passed the slide that I wanted to leave it on. Hold on. This is what really caught my attention. This is the sort of part of the secrecy of Trinity. When I read the excerpt from this Historical Society's inaugural address, and as Jarlath said, what's going on in England, but also in my home country, my new home country in America, the necessity for political honesty couldn't have been written at a better time for Bram, and hopefully people might read it again today. I'm going to read you an excerpt from that, because I think it tells us about young Bram. The wide-eyed Bram taking on the world, trying to change the world. Great stimulation here with people. And he writes, "The politicians of the day have been reared in a school in which the notions of right and wrong in state affairs were not at all those in personal affairs. We are, I hope, honest individuals, but we have not yet tried ourselves as honest politicians. And when we see men like ourselves gradually giving way to great force of self-interest, brought to bear on them by the very fact of their entrance into public life, we may well fear for our own future and take care, so far as we can, that our training here will enable us to resist these temptations when they come." And he ends with a statement that I think needs to be splashed all over places of men and women making big decisions. "We are young enough to hope, we are old enough to act, and in hope and action lies the future of ourselves, our country, and our race." How stimulating is that for a young man, a product of this environment right here. We see an idealistic and hopeful young man, but the difference is he's not just a dreamer. He's a man of action, someone who is very aware of all the things going on around him. And when he sees a need, he's willing to do something about it. A trend which I believe was fostered here at Trinity and also in his home life, which I can sum up in 3 words: passion, purpose, and action. I've seen plenty of young people, athletes, students, who develop passion. So many, however, get stuck when they try to turn that into purpose and aren't able to take any sort of action. That's not the case with Bram, though. I think these traits, in addition to his experiences here at the Hist, come from the influence of his mother as well. She was a lady who had great passion to help others. Bram also found when he was the clerk in petty sessions that when he was sent out to sort of check on all the other clerks, that he found they lacked purpose, and he did something about it. He wrote this book, and I'm not going to read this whole excerpt for you, but what it shows me is that Bram recognized the need, and even though his boss said, well, what are you going to do about it, Mr. Stoker? He said, go publish a book, which Bram did on his own. And one of the pieces that caught my eye, that's an excerpt from this, he says, such subjects as the advisability of uniform filing of papers or folding of returns, of using dots instead of O's in money columns, or of forwarding returns at the earliest instead of the latest date allowable may seem too trivial to treat of, yet every clerk would do well to remember that a rigid adherence to the advice on such matters which I have given would facilitate the audit of the returns almost in the measure of the services of a clerk in the registrar's office. Quite a long run-on sentence, but we get the point. The details that Bram Stoker feels are important filled up this book to make sure that people were treated fairly and justly throughout this country. And I'm proud to say that this book was in use until the 1960s. Some joke and say that it's his first horror novel, but maybe not. Back to Mr. Jean-Francois for a moment, because he says, yet after quite a few years, his trajectory would change again. This is Bram's, this time bringing him into a world of the theater and the orbit of Henry Irving, the owner and star actor of London's famed Lyceum Theatre. He would become a central influence in Stoker's personal, professional, and artistic life. Well, certainly what Bram did when he was in Dublin Castle was he saw that there was another need. In the newspapers, they were not actually doing accurate theatrical reviews. So he took it upon himself to go and speak to Mr. Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who was the editor of the newspaper, and says, I'll write the reviews. We can't pay you, Mr. Stoker. No problem, I'll do it. That was Bram's pass. That was a pass into the theater, into the world of stimulation for that other side of his brain. He had all the stimulation going with the mathematics and the duties of clerks of petty sessions, but that other side, that creative side, the writer side, the theatrical side needed fertilization, and he got it here in your theaters. And he went ahead with that and started publishing these reviews, which was wonderful. However, this didn't come without controversy. His father was not particularly thrilled about him sort of moving towards the theater, as he just paved the way for him to have a good job in Dublin Castle. So he wrote Bram a letter, and here's an excerpt of it. And I feel at this time it might have been difficult for Bram, you know, all the things he'd gone through, when his dad sends him a letter that says, although I'm ready to admit that in many instances their society, he's talking about the theater, was very agreeable, still I don't think they are altogether desirable acquaintances to those not connected with their own profession, if I may call it that, because it may involve expense and other matters which are not at all times advantageous. Under all the circumstances, I believe such acquaintances are better avoided. Can you imagine how devastated Bram had at that point? He's built up his confidence, he's writing reviews, and he meets Irving, and it's like, geez, what am I going to do with my life? And then his father sends him this. He didn't shrivel, because he had passion, and he had purpose, and he'll take action in just a moment. He gets the job to work with Irving after his father dies. Maybe that had something to do with it. But he has the confidence to move off to London with his new bride. This ledger book that you see here, I believe, is a result of his master's in mathematics that he got here, his number crunching. He finally helped the Lyceum Theatre become balanced and become profitable. It actually became the place to go between Irving and Stoker, who dreamed this up in the Shelburne Hotel about how to elevate the role of the theater in society, to get actors and actresses to stop being drunk all the time, wear the right costumes, and have the right sets. He really did elevate the role of theater in society to the point that Henry Irving became the first actor ever knighted for his contributions to the theater, and Bram Stoker gets a lot of accolades for that, mostly in his obituaries, funnily enough. But there is a touch of Dracula, and I'm going to get to that now. Because after watching Irving playing what I believe is his second most famous role, Mephistopheles, this had to run off on Bram. Watching this devil incarnate on stage, his friend, his boss, great stature of a man, playing this very convincing role of the assistant of the devil. This is the image, I think, the visual image that the painter is thinking of as he begins to develop his Dracula. Now here's backup to that theory, much like I showed you backup of the theory of the bloodletting. This is a page of the Dracula typescript. This is what caught my attention when I analyzed it, the things that were crossed out. Everything else you've already read if you've read the novel Dracula, but those things crossed out were taken out either by Bram or by his editor. And I've written it here for you. Even at that awful moment, with such tragedy before my eyes, the figure of Mephistopheles in the opera, cowering before Marguerite's lifted cross, swam up before me, and for an instant I wondered if I were mad. Further and further back the Count cowered as we were lifting our crucifix as we advanced. That is when Mina is having the blood exchange with Count Dracula in chapter 11. Bram was thinking of Mephistopheles as his image, but why was it crossed out, we don't know. But at least it backs up my theory that this left an image in Bram's mind. Now, there was obviously going on at the time to put things in perspective. He didn't just pull all these ideas out of thin air. There was a mystical side to Bram. And these things, I won't go into great detail, but just touch on them. That Edward Dowden was the professor here was a very respected member in the occult community, as was his daughter, who wrote a book about connecting with Oscar Wilde. Bram became a Freemason when he moved to London. J. Brodie Innes was a good friend of his who was a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, as was Conan Doyle. Bram was interested in helping the top left-hand corner, Pamela Coleman Smith. He sort of brought her off the street under her wing and got her to become a painter for the theater. She was the first painter who created the Smith-Waite tarot cards. She was into the occult and the Golden Dawn. There are 27 letters that have been discovered in the Leeds Library between Bram and people talking about the occult. Bram was interested in spiritualism. You can see a picture about mesmerism here on the bottom left. And he also really sort of drank the Kool-Aid of Walt Whitman about pantheism. So I think when Bram got to London and started into the theater, his mind opened up. This mind that was very fertile, that created here, was able to really go with a lot of things. And that's why we see such interesting things. One of the things that interests me, I have no answer for. But it's an interesting note in the opening pages of The Devil's Mistress by Brodie Innes. What does this mean? I don't know. Maybe Paul Murray can tell me later. To the memory of my dear friend, the author of Dracula, to whose help and encouragement I owe more than I'm at present liberty to state. Maybe it's just another mystery we have to find at some point, but maybe that's something between Brodie Innes and Stoker we don't know about. Bram's elder brother was very helpful in his life, very influential in writing Dracula. Bram wanted to be right and accurate in everything in this novel, and that's why, as I finally get around to this in my talk, it made such an impact on people. It felt realistic in real time. All the medical issues in the novel were banged straight on because Dr. William Thornley Stoker, who was the head of the Royal College of Surgeons here, was his assistant, as you could call him, writing the novel. All the medical pieces in 21 about the brain trephination surgery that Seward and Van Helsing did was because Bram's brother actually did this surgery 3 times. Twice successful, one not so. Infection, apparently. But one of them, as you can see, his handwriting there in the Rosenbach notes, actually has the patient wake up and request a glass of water, much like Renfield did in the story. So Bram was really lucky that his brother was helping him. And there's lots of notes in the typescript. There's brothers telling him what type of knives to use, how to do the transfusions, to make it seem realistic. One other interesting piece that I've come across recently is that Thornley was an inspector of vivisection. And I didn't realize that was a thing at the time. Doctors who were doing brain surgeries in big theaters, where they take the skull off of a monkey or a dog to look at what was going on inside the brain and poke little things and see what would happen. Yes, that was necessary in many cases, but sometimes it was taken to the extreme, and these animals would suffer. And so there were medical boards convened to stop this from happening. Thornley, who was a surgeon himself of the brain and so on, became an inspector to make sure if these surgeries were necessary or not. He influenced his brother in chapter 6 to actually paint a picture of Dracula as an evil scientist doing these type of weird experimentations on Renfield. And then he actually talks here where Dr. Seward says it would almost be worthwhile to complete the experiment. This is on Renfield. It might be done if there were only a sufficient cause. Men sneered at vivisection, and yet look at the results today. Why not advance science in its most difficult and vital aspect, the knowledge of the brain? Had I even the secret of one such mind, did I hold the key to the fancy of even one lunatic? I might advance my own branch of science to a pitch compared with what Burden Sanderson's physiology or Ferrier's brand knowledge would be as nothing, if only there was sufficient cause. That's Thornley speaking right there. Bram inserts these social issues, medical issues into the story. You just have to know where to look and where they came from. I started looking at the list of books that his widow sold when he died to get another glimpse into what was Bram looking at? What was he reading? You know, we learn about people. You are what you eat. You are what you read. You are what you do. These are some of the books. The Bilateral Cipher of Sir Francis Bacon. This book obviously took great interest to Bram. He used that in The Mystery of the Sea. Witchcraft and Second Sight in the Highlands of Scotland. It's the only book that Bram ever reviewed, and it's made its way into a newspaper in New Zealand. But this made its way into Mystery of the Sea. Mark Twain was a great neighbor and friend of Bram's, so we'll get onto that in a little bit. But one of them was this book by Oscar Wilde's mother. Bram was great friends with Willie Wilde, Oscar's older brother, but also she provided, I believe, literary backup, literary enthusiasm to Bram. And there was a sort of inspiration when he didn't get it from his father. And look at this. This is the book, one of the books that she wrote that was in the London Library, which we'll get to in a moment. And I think this was the beginning thread of Bram moving towards his research, painstaking research into Dracula. Top left-hand corner, in the Transylvanian legends and superstitions of which Madame Gerard has recently given an interesting record, many will be found identical with the Irish. So he cut his teeth on these young folklores as a young boy when his mother told him about Irish mythology and folklore, and she drew a parallel to Transylvania, and this Madame Gerard, who we'll see in a moment, gave Bram extensive information about Transylvanian superstition. Well, Bram's theater role took him to America 8 times. They brought the Lyceum Theater and 100 of the workers over to America, traveled all over the country. You can see one of the letterheads from their 5th tour where they went. I've looked at all these places, looked into the newspapers and see what they say about them. One of them, they met Buffalo Bill, a showman who Bram Stoker and Henry Irving helped bring over to England, to Glasgow, to Edinburgh, wowed audiences, boatload of Indians and cowboys and horses and things coming over doing the Wild West show. But it also brought Bram an interesting connection to Buffalo Bill, who he modeled 3 of his written literature characters after. Of course, Quincy Morris, Elias Hutcheson in The Squaw, and a most unfortunately named man in The Shoulder of Shasta, Grizzly Dick, was one of his characters modeled after Buffalo Bill. Here's a bit of Bram's handiwork when we look at the detail-oriented man who may have also needed maps like this when he was the inspector of clerks of petty sessions traveling around Ireland. He sketched on this map of the United States the train routes and the distances, all the places he had to go. This is detail-oriented Bram bringing hundreds of people all around America 8 times to make sure they got to the right train station at the right time with all the right trucks waiting for them. He did exactly the same thing in the novel Dracula. Here's a page from his notes with all the accurate train schedules taking Jonathan Harker from London across to the Borgo Pass. You can see everything right to scale, right to the right time. He even made friends with Mark Twain, who was his neighbor, but they were more than just friends. They were very close. They had long chats and conversations about many things, spiritualism being one of them. Bram Stoker even took a quote from Mark Twain and inserted it into Dracula in this way. Bram Stoker became the agent for Mark Twain's book Roundabout the Equator to get it published in London. In that book, there was a quote that says, "Faith is believing what you know ain't so." Typical Mark Twain. Bram took that and twisted it a little bit in a very important part of the novel. When Van Helsing is trying to convince Dr. Seward, who was a narrow-minded doctor interested and a proponent of the scientific process, and sometimes that was clouding his vision on what was going on. They had been putting all this blood into Lucy with transfusions, and yet they'd come back, the band of heroes, the next day, and there'd be no blood in her. And Seward couldn't understand why that was happening. He could not prove that scientifically, and Van Helsing was trying to say, look, there's more to life than just the scientific process. And he says, I once heard of an American who so defined faith as that which enables us to believe things we know to be untrue. This is the American that said that. You may not believe what's going to happen with blood, but it's really happening. We just need to dig deeper, open your mind. That's one of the messages that Bram is telling. At this time, there was great conflict between sort of narrowing our minds with science and yet keeping them open with understanding of the old ways. The old and the new is good, but don't throw away the old. Whitby Holiday brought Bram here to the Gothic sort of atmosphere of St. Mary's Church in Whitby Abbey. He went there only one time, but boy, did it have a big impact on him. Before he went to Whitby, he was writing Dracula to actually land in Dover. And then this one holiday in 1890 changed it. Luckily, he went into this museum and library and found a book by a guy called William Wilkinson, who wrote all about this guy called Dracula. This picture wasn't in the book, but certainly the description of this was. Dracula, in the Wallachian language, means devil. Must have jumped out of the page at Bram after seeing Irving as Mephistopheles. The Wallachians were, at that time as they are at present, used to give this as a surname to any person who rendered himself conspicuous, either by courage, cruel action, or cunning. That description was used twice in the novel by Van Helsing to explain to the band of heroes who this Dracula was. But like any good student, Bram listed all of his resource books in the back of the Rosenbach notes. So we know exactly what books he was looking at. This was another one. James Samuelson was a lawyer in London. He wrote a book about Romania, past and present. You can see the top right-hand corner. They were talking about, as we have said, the Turks who were so much afraid of Hunyadis, who was the Austrian-Hungarian leader, who was an ally of Vlad Dracula. He was named the devil, but they mentioned Vlad Dracula comes by that name much more honestly because of his brutality and his cruelty. Didn't say that he was a vampire, but he was a devil. 2 books, the devil. Irving, the devil. That's what Bram's looking for. And this is the page that Bram altered after doing that research. This is probably the most famous page in his notes, where in the middle of that page you see Count Vampire crossed out. Until he went to Whitby and looked at those books, we believe he was going to call his Count an Austrian name for a vampire, rather than Dracula. We might not all be here talking about Dracula, that name, which doesn't sound quite as powerful. This is an important page where you see all these other characters beginning to take shape. Now, for the members of the Dublin Painting and Sketching Club and anybody else that wants to look at what some of Bram's artwork looks like, here's a picture, a drone shot of Tate Hill Sands, of Collier's Hope. Bram sketched it. That's from his notebook. Why? Because he didn't start writing the novel in Whitby. He started writing it 2 years later in Cruden Bay, and he needed to have a diagram of what it looked like. So that's his sketch, so he could go back and get everything just right. And by gosh, he really did get it right, because he managed to find in the records of the Coast Guard an actual ship called the Dimitri that wrecked in 1885, and Bram had exactly the same account of Count Dracula coming in a ship, just changed the name to the Demeter, and he set the story in real time. Even though the book was written in 1897, he set it in 1893. Real places, based on real things, real names, and real history. Now, lots of details about geography that Bram got right in this story, and having never gone to Transylvania, but he did go to the London Library, and this is a fairly recent discovery by a Philip Spedding. Philip Spedding noticed all the names of the books in the back of the Dracula notes, and they didn't have records because of bombings and fires and things in the London Library, but he had the sense to walk through the aisles of the London Library and looked at these names of books, and he found 26 of them. They're right there. And then he contacted me and said, Dacre, we have a bit of a problem. He says, there's all sorts of strange pencil marks in the margins. I think Bram might have defaced some of the books. That's how the British tabloids got this headline, that Dracula writer was a sucker for defacing the books. They'll jump at anything, right, to sell the newspaper. I found it absolutely fascinating, especially when he said, don't worry, we're not going to charge you guys for defacing the books. But we are going to be able to say that it's probably, we can give great credit to the London Library being ground zero for Bram's research, which I believe it was. Now look at some of the contents here of these books. On the Truths of Popular Superstitions, an account of mesmerism by a very respected Herbert Mayo. Bram writes mesmerist right underneath my red writing. He was a mesmerist. That's where Bram got all this information between Mina and the blood exchange with Dracula and reading each other's minds. And then look at some of the titles here on the table of contents. This is on the truths of superstitions: vampires, unreal ghosts, true ghosts, trance walk, trance sleep. This is where Bram got the idea for Lucy being under a trance and walking across Whitby. So I'm thinking that everything I've told you about the last half an hour of all Bram's early thoughts and the traumatic upbringing and the Irish tales have all been sort of manifesting in his head. But when he goes to the library and he gets truths, he's hit pay dirt, folks, because he's writing a book, a true book about vampirism to make people believe it's true. And these are some of the books that he found there to back him up. Now you can see one of the defacings here. Just a little pencil mark, I said to Philip, just a little pencil mark. You can always erase it. But what Bram found in this book by a Reverend Frederick George Lee, none less. This is a Church of England minister that writes a book, The Other World, or Glimpses of the Supernatural, being facts, records, and traditions, relating to dreams, omens, miraculous occurrences, aberrations, wraiths, warnings, second sight, witchcraft, and necromancy. Bram finds a little piece that I am sure resonated with him to place this story high up in the Carpathian Mountains. It is commonly held that in lonely deserts, on lofty mountains where the feet of men seldom tread, as well as in the mines of the earth and in the vast forests where the desolation reigns, the powers of the devil and his angels, being unchecked and uncurbed by the positive energizing activity of Christianity, are vast. There's our devil again, folks. It's all coming together for Uncle Bram here. Another book, Superstition Enforced by the American Henry Charles Lee. Check mark. Little check, Bram. Volcanoes have always been the objects of superstitious fear. They were supposed to be produced by subterranean gods who reside in the interior of the earth. Bram then takes that and writes chapter 24, because I know he didn't take geology courses here. I don't think you had them there, but he was enamored with geology and the connection between the supernatural and the natural world. The very place where he had been alive, undead for all these centuries, is full of strangeness of the geologic and chemical world. They are deep caverns and fissures that reach none whither. There have been volcanoes, some of whose openings still send out waters of strange properties and gases that kill or make to vivify. This is the fertile ground of the Carpathian Mountains where the Count Dracula lives. And sure enough, there were books about volcanoes in the London Library that Bram referred to. This sentence was crossed out, though. This was one of these sentences where Bram was referring to the real person, Luigi Palmieri, when Van Helsing says, because he feels tremors, he smells gases, he smells sulfurous gases as he's moving in at the end of the novel to try to destroy the Count up in these mountains. He said, I would that my old friend Palmieri of Naples were here, and with him his wonderful seismograph, for he could give me some clue as to what is happening or about to happen. Whatever it is, as the ground is hardening to receive it. This is the last chapter of the story, and it's getting very weird as the band of heroes are chasing Count Dracula, being led by the gypsies as they get close to his fictional castle Dracula. But before we get there, this is why he got there. Emily Gerard, the Scottish lady, she was a writer from Airdrie, also raised in Jedburgh. She wrote very extensive notes about Transylvanian superstitions. She was enamored with Scottish superstitions, and when she got over there, was married to a man in the Austrian-Hungarian cavalry. She wrote all about Nosferatu and Strigoi. As a matter of fact, this little piece that I pulled out of her notes, Bram's notes, pulled out of her essay, tells Bram exactly how he gets to kill a vampire. To kill a vampire, drive a stake through the corpse or fire a pistol shot into the coffin, or cut the head and replace in the coffin with a mouthful of garlic, or extract the heart and burn it and strew ashes over the grave. Once again, Bram didn't have to make this up. He had some authority on superstition write it all for him. And that's exactly how Van Helsing told the band of heroes to do away with Lucy. But funnily enough, as we get to the end of this whole thing, it's not how they destroyed the Count. Bear with me just a little bit longer. Here's some images of vampires' treaties that Bram would have been aware of. This was rampant in the Middle Ages, with people not understanding germ theory and decomposition of bodies. And they would misunderstand these bodies that they would dig up. Now this one with the brick in the mouth and the Mascatoni Moratorium, the chewing dead, was a treatise written by a guy called Philip Rohr in 1733 about finding 40-odd bodies in a very shallow grave. And this is a little bit gross, but bear with me. As the bodies decomposed, some of the last things to go were the jaw tissues, tendons holding together. When the jaws came down, because it was such a shallow grave, being in Venice, people on top still alive could hear crunching noises. And they were convinced that maybe the souls of these bodies were coming out and taking the living. They didn't understand, as I said, about germ theory. So they dug up some of these bodies, and they could see these bloated bodies with the shroud around their face, got red stuff around it, which is just the biological decomposition, but it looked to them as the blood of the living filling up the stomach. So what would they do? Stick a brick in their mouth to stop them from chewing their way out. This is how people solved the problems in those days. And Bram got a hold of these ideas and capitalized on this. But you know what? It didn't just happen in the 1700s. On one of Bram's trips to New York, he found a newspaper article in a New York World newspaper in 1896 that had the same thing happening in New England. Over 50 state-approved exhumations of graves for exactly the same thing that was happening in the Middle Ages. People didn't realize that the signs and symptoms of tuberculosis were just the same as plague and so on. And people were being taken out of the grave, their hearts taken out, burned at crossroads, a stew of the ashes fed to people, Mercy Brown, Saring Tillinghast being some of them. But the other thing in this article that really, I think, hit home with Bram, that he used in the novel, absolutely, was Charles Darwin, who had published Origin of the Species in 1859, which shocked the religious world and the scientific world just a little bit. In this article, in the last column, the article says, and Darwin discovered these vampire bats in South America. And he said, when the bats came out of the trees and drank blood from the cattle, we had to shoo them away. Bram Stoker took those same words and put them in the mouth of Quincy Morris and said, yes, when we were in South America, the vampire bats came out of the trees and drank so much blood from my famous mare I had to put her down. A slight exaggeration, but that's literary license. But he was referencing the scientist Darwin. Now, just before I end, I always like to clear up things because I know we've got some friends that have foreign affairs in mind. If anybody's ever been to Transylvania, you usually go and visit Castle Dracula. Castle Dracula, better known as Bran Castle, does have a connection to Uncle Bram's book. This picture, this sketch, was in one of the books in the London Library that Philip Spedding showed me, by Charles Bonner. And I believe the artist in Bram was sitting there when he was looking at this sketch, because this sketch was also replicated in a book by Elizabeth Mattucelli, which was also in the London Library. But of all the books, there was only this castle, which was sketched. And when I read the description that Bram wrote, it's exactly like this castle. So I think he sat here like we are today looking at that, and he described Bran Castle. Then he turned it into Dracula's castle. A real castle, not in the right place, though. He also did most of his work, writing and relaxing, in Cruden Bay, Scotland, where this castle was there. This was called Slains Castle, New Slains Castle, they call it. And he was invited into Slains Castle a couple of times. And when he was, I believe, he got the inspiration for the exact interior layout as he described it in chapter 2. So bear with me when I read this to you, because I believe Bram walked in exactly the same way. In the front door of Slains Castle, Harker says, In Castle Dracula, the Count halted, put in down my bags, closed the door, crossing the room, opened another door, which led into a small octagonal room lit by a single lamp and seemingly without a window of any sort. Passing through this, he opened another door and motioned me to enter. It was a welcome sight. That octagonal room has no window to the outside, and it is lit by a single lamp. Bram merged two real castles together and placed it far enough in the northeastern portion of the Carpathian Mountains. This is also one of the maps from the back of the Charles Bonner book. I photocopied it and I defaced it. Bram didn't do this, so it was just a photocopy. Funnily enough, you can see when I drew the line of the train line that Harker went on, the carriage line from Bistritza, there really is a Borgo Pass. Bram didn't have to make that up. And that little dotted line just down below takes you to the mountain where he placed this fictional castle. We'll get to that in just a second. Here is a better map, or a cleaner version, and that's pointing to the 47th degree north latitude that Bram references in his notes. And the star down below is actually where Bran Castle really is. So Bram took the castle he described in the book and simply moved it into the right location with the right floor plan from his castle in Scotland. Why did he have to put it up there, folks? Why did he give us these lines of longitude and latitude? Because he was a precise guy, probably because his master's in mathematics and all these other legal things he did. He liked to get things absolutely right. And what that did, that actually put us into this location where I ended up going just a couple of years ago, it is an extinct volcano. Bram's detailed enough when he had the whole story with the devil, the volcano being the portals to hell, would have to be on an extinct volcano. And what backs that up even more, because that's where those lines converge right there, is that the deleted ending to Dracula that sits in Seattle, Washington, and not many people know about. Right after the Count was stabbed with the Bowie knife and he crumbled into dust to make his escape, had he or his editor not crossed out those lines in the paper, we would have had a volcanic eruption. Bram Stoker, as you've come to know him, is so detail-oriented that if he's going to have a volcanic eruption, by golly, he's going to have that castle on an actual volcano. And sure enough, it was. Now to end with, let me catch up. Jean-Francois says, Bram Stoker then, one might conclude, was a fine all-around man who's combined his oratorial skill with his business management, who composed serious essays and sensational stories. He is but one example out of the many who can truly be said to have benefited from the breadth and the depth of a Trinity education. And as I said, I can sum that up by adding three more words: passion, purpose, and action. With the continued support and recognition of Bram Stoker and his association with Trinity College Historical Society, I could not agree more than Mr. Francois. Bram, his life and his writing, the result of a firm foundation with results in his varied and successful life, follow the Trinity College motto. And I can't speak Latin very well, but bear with me. Perpetuus, virtuis, temporibus, duratorium. Like the portrait we're about to unveil, I hope it will last into endless future times, as Bram's legacy have, with all of your help. I thank you very much.
Civil servant and as a plague victim, of course. These are things which we're very familiar with today. But I think what came through to me was, if Bram Stoker, as Dacre described him, as full of passion, purpose, and action, I think that's a good description of what we've just got from Dacre, who is full of clear passion for his great-granduncle's work and continues to try to sort of find out new little sort of tidbits and nuggets of information to illuminate not just Dracula, but Stoker's very varied, very complicated life. I'd like to again thank Dacre for coming and for giving this very passionate, very energetic and very illuminating talk. We're going to now retire for his unveiling. I'm told there's not a veil, apparently, but a metaphorical unveiling of Mick O'Dee's portrait. We have to thank Dacre as well for his contribution for fundraising for this portrait. But I'd like to very much just give another round of applause to
Thank you.
We'll now retire to upstairs. Is that where we're going?
First floor conversation.
First floor conversation.
Thank you, Jarlath.
Thanks for that. It's great. Great to see the.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, let's unplug this, put this back. I don't know how to turn it off.
That's all right. Do that.
You won't be able to.